In the early hours of June 22, 1941, one of the largest military invasions in history began without warning. Along a front stretching for nearly 3,000 kilometers, millions of German soldiers and their allies surged into Soviet territory under the codename Operation Barbarossa. For the men advancing east, the outcome already seemed decided. This was not expected to be a prolonged war. It was supposed to be a campaign measured in weeks. German confidence was not baseless. In less than 2 years, the Wehrmacht had shattered much of Europe with a method that seemed unstoppable. Poland collapsed in just over a month. France, considered one of the strongest military powers in the world, fell in 6 weeks. The combination of speed, coordination, and overwhelming force, what the world came to know as Blitzkrieg, had proven devastatingly effective. Tanks broke through enemy lines, aircraft destroyed communications and supply routes, and infantry followed to encircle entire armies. Again and again, opponents were caught off guard, disoriented, and ultimately crushed. By the summer of 1941, many within the German High Command believed the Soviet Union would suffer the same fate. Intelligence reports painted a picture of weakness. The Red Army had recently undergone massive purges under Joseph Stalin, removing thousands of experienced officers. The Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland had been widely seen as clumsy and inefficient. To German planners, this suggested a military force that was poorly led, disorganized, and vulnerable. There was also a deeper assumption at play, one rooted not just in strategy but in ideology. Nazi leadership viewed the Soviet Union as fundamentally inferior both politically and militarily. This belief reinforced the idea that resistance would collapse quickly once the initial shock of invasion took hold. The campaign was planned accordingly. Supplies were calculated for a short war. Winter equipment was barely considered. The expectation was clear: victory would come before the cold. As the invasion unfolded, the early results seemed to confirm everything German commanders had predicted. Soviet defenses were overwhelmed along multiple fronts. Entire units were encircled in massive pockets, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured within the first weeks. German armored divisions advanced rapidly, sometimes covering dozens of kilometers in a single day. Roads filled with destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment. The Red Army appeared to be collapsing. Reports from the front described scenes of chaos. Soviet formations, caught unprepared, struggled to coordinate a response. Communication lines were disrupted by airstrikes. Command structures faltered under pressure. In many sectors, resistance was fierce but uncoordinated, allowing German forces to exploit gaps and continue pushing forward. It seemed as though the Soviet Union was unraveling under the weight of the assault. For German soldiers on the ground, the advance felt relentless, almost effortless. Each day brought new territory gained, new prisoners taken, new victories recorded. Officers spoke of reaching key objectives ahead of schedule. There was even talk that Moscow itself might fall before the end of the year. The sense of momentum was overwhelming, and with it came a growing belief that nothing could stop the advance. But beneath this confidence, cracks were already beginning to form. Subtle at first, easy to ignore. The distances were vast, far greater than anything experienced in Western Europe. Supply lines stretched thin as fuel and ammunition had to travel hundreds of kilometers over poor roads. Vehicles broke down, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and the pace of advance began to strain the very system that made Blitzkrieg possible. More importantly, the Soviet Union was not reacting the way previous enemies had. Despite catastrophic losses, new units kept appearing. Entire armies thought to be destroyed were replaced with fresh formations.
Factories deep inside Soviet territory were being relocated even as the fighting continued, ensuring that production would not stop. The scale of the country and its ability to absorb punishment was unlike anything Germany had faced before. Still, in these early weeks, such concerns were overshadowed by success. The numbers seemed undeniable. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners, thousands of destroyed tanks and aircraft, vast stretches of land captured in record time. For many in the German command, this was proof that their assumptions had been correct from the start. And yet there was something they had not fully accounted for, something that did not fit neatly into intelligence reports or ideological beliefs. The Red Army, despite its losses, was not finished. It was adapting, reorganizing, and preparing in ways that were not immediately visible from the front lines. At this stage, the German advance continued, confident and aggressive, pushing deeper into Soviet territory with each passing day. The idea of an easy victory still held strong. But beneath this belief, there was something they had not fully accounted for. Something that would challenge not just their tactics, but their understanding of the war itself.
By the time the first weeks of the invasion had passed, the pace of the German advance was still impressive, but something had begun to change. What initially felt like a rapid, unstoppable push into Soviet territory was slowly becoming more complicated, more unpredictable. The maps still showed progress, arrows moving steadily eastward, but on the ground, the reality was far less certain. The vastness of the Soviet Union revealed itself quickly. Distances that looked manageable on paper turned into exhausting, drawn-out marches. Supply lines stretched thinner with every kilometer gained. Fuel trucks struggled to keep up with fast-moving armored divisions. Roads, where they existed, were often little more than dirt tracks, quickly churned into mud by the constant movement of vehicles. Dust in dry weather, thick mud after rain, both became enemies in their own way. German logistics, so finely tuned for short, decisive campaigns in Western Europe, were now under strain. Tanks that had raced across France were breaking down in unfamiliar conditions. Spare parts were limited. Horses, still essential for transporting supplies, began to collapse under the pressure. The deeper the advance, the harder it became to maintain the speed that Blitzkrieg depended on. And then there was the terrain itself. Endless forests, wide rivers, and open plains created new tactical challenges. Unlike the relatively dense infrastructure of Western Europe, much of this land offered little support for rapid movement. Bridges were destroyed by retreating Soviet forces, forcing delays. Rivers became natural defensive lines. Every obstacle slowed the advance just enough to give the defenders time to regroup. But perhaps the most unexpected factor was the Soviet response. Despite suffering massive losses in the opening weeks, the Red Army did not collapse. Instead, it absorbed the blow and continued fighting. Units that had been encircled often resisted far longer than anticipated. In some cases, they fought until they were completely cut off, tying down German forces that were supposed to be pushing forward. New Soviet troops kept appearing, sometimes poorly equipped, sometimes lacking experience, but present nonetheless. It created a strange and unsettling pattern for German commanders. Just when it seemed a sector had been cleared, new resistance would emerge. Just when victory appeared close, another line of defense formed further east. There was also a growing sense that the enemy was learning. Early in the campaign, Soviet forces had been caught off guard, reacting slowly and often ineffectively. But as the weeks passed, their responses became more coordinated. Counterattacks, though costly, were launched with increasing frequency. Defensive positions were established more quickly. The initial shock was wearing off. For the German soldiers, the psychological effect was subtle but significant. The war no longer felt like a series of quick victories. It was becoming a grind, still advancing, but with increasing resistance and uncertainty. Long marches, limited supplies, and constant engagements began to wear down even experienced units.
Communication also became more difficult. As units pushed deeper into Soviet territory, maintaining coordination between divisions grew more complex. Radios were not always reliable over long distances, and delays in orders could lead to confusion on the battlefield. The precision that had defined earlier Blitzkrieg operations was harder to maintain. Meanwhile, the weather began to play its role. Summer heat, combined with dust and exhaustion, affected both men and machines. And though winter was not yet present, its shadow loomed over the campaign. Few had prepared for a prolonged war, and fewer still had considered what would happen if the fighting continued into the colder months. At higher levels of command, there were already signs of concern. Some officers began to question whether the initial assumptions about the Soviet Union had been too optimistic. The idea of a quick collapse was starting to fade, replaced by the realization that this was a fundamentally different kind of war, one defined not just by speed, but by endurance. Still, the overall momentum had not yet been broken. German forces continued to advance, capturing territory and engaging retreating Soviet units. On paper, the operation still appeared successful, but beneath that success, the situation was becoming more fragile. Because the deeper they moved, the more they were entering a war that did not behave as expected. A war where distance, resilience, and sheer scale began to challenge even the most effective tactics. And somewhere ahead, beyond the dust, the forests, and the long supply lines, something new was waiting. Something that would turn uncertainty into shock and force the German army to confront a threat it had not truly prepared for.
It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything changed, no clear signal that something entirely new had entered the battlefield. Instead, it began with confusion, reports that didn't quite make sense, sightings that were dismissed at first, fragments of information that seemed exaggerated or simply wrong. German units advancing through the early morning fog began to notice shapes moving in the distance. At first, they assumed they were dealing with familiar Soviet tanks, models they had already encountered and learned to defeat. Light armor, predictable movement, vulnerable to the weapons the Wehrmacht had used successfully since the beginning of the invasion. There was no reason to expect anything different. But as the fog shifted and visibility improved, those assumptions started to break down. The silhouettes were unfamiliar, larger than expected, lower to the ground, yet somehow more imposing. Their movement was steady, deliberate, cutting through terrain that should have slowed them down. Mud, uneven ground, obstacles that had caused problems for German vehicles, none of it seemed to matter. Then came the first shots. German anti-tank crews, trained and confident, moved into position and opened fire. The impact was clear, direct hits, exactly as they had done countless times before. But this time, something was wrong. The shells struck the armor and failed to penetrate. Instead of stopping or bursting into flames, the tanks kept moving. At first, it was disbelief. Crews reloaded, adjusted their aim, fired again, more hits, same result. The rounds bounced or shattered against the sloped armor, leaving little more than scars. The expectation of a quick kill turned into a growing realization that these machines were different. Panic did not come immediately, but uncertainty did. Orders were shouted, units repositioned. Some soldiers attempted to get closer, aiming for weaker points, trying to adapt in real time. But the battlefield was already shifting. The tanks continued their advance. From inside German ranks, the experience was deeply unsettling. For months, their tactics had worked with precision: identify the target, engage, destroy, move forward. Now, that sequence was breaking apart. Weapons that were supposed to stop enemy armor were suddenly unreliable. Strategies that guaranteed success were no longer enough. Eyewitness accounts describe the moment with a kind of disbelief that borders on shock. Soldiers watching as shells hit their targets with no effect. officers trying to understand what they were facing while the situation deteriorated around them. The sense that something fundamental had changed, even if they couldn't yet explain how or why. Some units attempted to flank the advancing tanks, aiming for thinner side or rear armor. Others called for heavier support, artillery, airstrikes, anything that might slow the advance. But coordination took time, and time was exactly what they did not have. The terrain added to the chaos. Fog limited visibility, making it difficult to track movement or estimate numbers. The ground, already difficult, became even more dangerous as the new tanks maneuvered with unexpected ease. Where German vehicles hesitated, these machines pushed forward without pause. And then was the psychological impact. For soldiers on the front line, war often depends as much on expectation as it does on reality. Confidence in equipment, in tactics, in leadership, these are the things that hold units together under pressure. But in that moment, those foundations began to crack, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of something far more unsettling: the realization that the enemy possessed a weapon they did not fully understand. Reports began to flow back to command. Descriptions of heavily armored tanks, resistant to standard anti-tank fire. Accounts that sounded exaggerated, almost impossible. Some dismissed them as battlefield confusion. Others recognized the seriousness immediately. But for the men facing them directly, there was no doubt. This was not the enemy they had prepared for. As the engagement continued, German forces were forced to improvise. Some crews resorted to close-range attacks, risking everything to disable the tanks at vulnerable points. Others used whatever heavy weapons were available, hoping to slow them down long enough to regroup. Every solution came with increased danger, increased uncertainty. And through it all, the tanks kept advancing. They did not rush, they did not scatter. They moved with a steady, almost mechanical confidence, as if the chaos around them had no effect. Each meter gained reinforced the same conclusion. This was something new, something that could not be handled with the tactics of the past. By the time the fighting subsided, the impact of the encounter was already clear. This was more than just a difficult engagement. It was a warning, one that would echo through the ranks and reach the highest levels of command. Because for the first time since the invasion had begun, the German army had encountered a weapon that challenged its dominance on the battlefield. And as reports spread and questions grew, one realization became impossible to ignore. The war they thought they understood was beginning to change.
What German forces had encountered in those moments of confusion was not just a new tank, it was a fundamental shift in battlefield design. As more reports came in and captured examples were studied, a clearer picture began to form. The machine they were facing had a name, the T-34, and almost everything about it challenged the assumptions that German armored doctrine had been built upon. At first glance, it did not seem dramatically different. It was not the heaviest tank on the battlefield, nor the most heavily armed by sheer caliber alone. But its effectiveness came from something far more important: the way its design combined multiple advantages into a single, highly efficient system. The most immediate and shocking feature was its armor. German crews quickly realized that it wasn't just thicker, it was angled. Sloped armor increased the effective thickness and caused incoming shells to deflect rather than penetrate. This was something German anti-tank weapons were not designed to handle at scale. Shots that would have destroyed other tanks simply glanced off, leaving crews exposed and confused. Then there was its mobility. Unlike many tanks of the time, the T-34 could move across rough terrain with remarkable ease. Its wide tracks distributed weight more effectively, allowing it to cross mud, snow, and soft ground without becoming stuck.
In conditions where German vehicles struggled or slowed down, the T-34 maintained speed and maneuverability. It could appear in places where it wasn't expected, attack from angles that were difficult to predict, and keep advancing when others would have stalled. Its main gun added another layer to the problem. Capable of penetrating German armor at significant distances, it meant that engagements were no longer one-sided. German tanks, many of which were designed during earlier phases of the war, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. They could be destroyed from ranges where their own weapons were less effective. But what made the T-34 truly disruptive was not any single feature, it was the combination of all of them. Protection, firepower, and mobility working together in a way that forced a complete rethink of how armored warfare was conducted. It was not just a stronger opponent, it was a smarter design. For German commanders, this created an immediate tactical problem. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, coordination, and the ability to break through enemy lines quickly. But when faced with an opponent that could resist initial attacks and counter effectively, that momentum began to slow. Every delay created new risks. Every engagement required more planning, more resources, more caution. Anti-tank units had to adapt quickly. Crews were instructed to aim for weaker points, to engage at closer ranges, to coordinate with artillery whenever possible, but these adjustments came at a cost. Closing distance increased danger. Relying on heavier weapons slowed down operations. The efficiency that had defined earlier campaigns began to erode. Tank crews felt the change just as strongly. Encounters that would have once been straightforward now carried uncertainty. Engaging a T-34 required careful positioning, precise timing, and often a degree of luck. The balance of confidence had shifted. At higher levels, the implications were impossible to ignore. If this tank could be produced in large numbers, and early signs suggested that it could, it would represent a long-term challenge, not just a temporary obstacle. German industry and design would need to respond, but that would take time that the battlefield was not offering. There was also a growing recognition that this was only part of a larger picture. The T-34 was not appearing in isolation. It was supported by an industrial system that, despite early losses, was reorganizing and expanding deeper inside the Soviet Union. Factories were being relocated, production lines restarted, output increased. The possibility of facing more of these tanks in the months ahead was becoming a certainty. And with that realization came a shift in perspective. The invasion was no longer just about rapid conquest. It was becoming a test of endurance, adaptation, and industrial capacity. The advantages that had carried German forces through earlier victories were now being challenged by an opponent capable of evolving under pressure. On the battlefield, the change was already visible. Engagements were becoming longer, more contested. Advances slowed as resistance stiffened. The sense of inevitability that had marked the early days of the invasion began to fade, replaced by something far more uncertain. The T-34 had not stopped the German advance, but it had changed its nature. It forced hesitation where there had once been speed. It introduced risk where there had once been confidence. It proved that the enemy was capable not only of resisting, but of innovating in ways that could not be easily countered. And perhaps most importantly, it signaled that the war in the East would not be decided quickly. Because now, the German army was facing a reality it had not fully prepared for, a war where superiority was no longer guaranteed, and where every advantage would have to be earned the hard way.
By the time the initial shock had settled, it was clear that what had happened on those fog-covered battlefields was not an isolated incident. Reports continued to arrive from multiple sectors, all describing the same thing: encounters with a tank that defied expectations and disrupted established tactics. The pattern was undeniable. This was not a rare anomaly.
It was a sign of what was coming. German command could no longer afford to dismiss or underestimate the threat. The appearance of the T-34 forced a shift in thinking at every level. What had begun as a campaign built on speed and decisive victory was now evolving into something far more complex. The assumptions that shaped the invasion about the enemy's weakness, about the duration of the war, were being challenged in real time. The first response was immediate adaptation. Field units were instructed to change how they engaged these tanks. Anti-tank crews were told to hold fire until closer range, increasing the chance of penetration, but also increasing the danger. Artillery was brought forward more aggressively, used not just in support, but as a primary means of dealing with heavily armored targets. Air support was called in whenever possible, though even that was not always reliable under changing battlefield conditions. Improvisation became a necessity. German soldiers, known for their discipline and training, now had to rely on flexibility and quick thinking. Some units used coordinated attacks, combining multiple weapons to overwhelm a single target. Others experimented with ambush tactics, using terrain and concealment to gain an advantage. Every encounter became a learning experience, but also a reminder that the old methods were no longer enough on their own. At the same time, discussions began at higher levels about longer-term solutions. If the T-34 represented a new standard in tank design, then Germany would need to respond with designs of its own capable of matching or surpassing it. Engineers and planners started analyzing captured examples, studying their armor, their mobility, their construction. The goal was clear: understand the threat, then build something that could defeat it. But designing and producing new tanks was not something that could happen overnight. Even as plans were being drawn, the war continued. The forces on the front lines had to deal with the reality in front of them, using the tools they already had. And that meant fighting an enemy that was not only holding its ground, but growing stronger. Because while Germany was reacting, the Soviet Union was accelerating. Production of the T-34 increased as factories were relocated beyond the reach of German forces. What had initially appeared as a surprising new weapon was becoming a central part of Soviet strategy. More units were equipped, more crews trained, more tanks sent to the front. The balance was beginning to shift, not suddenly, not decisively, but steadily. The idea of a quick victory, once so dominant in German planning, was now fading. In its place came the realization that this war would be long, demanding, and unpredictable. Every advance would come at a cost. Every success would require sustained effort. The Eastern Front was no longer a campaign of rapid conquest. It was becoming a war of attrition. For the soldiers on the ground, this change was deeply felt. The early confidence, built on a series of rapid victories, gave way to caution. Every new engagement carried uncertainty. Every distant engine sound, every movement in the fog, could signal another encounter with a tank that had already proven its ability to change the course of a battle. And yet, the fighting continued. The German army pushed forward, adapting where it could, holding on to the initiative where possible. But the nature of that advance had changed. It was slower, more deliberate, more contested. The sense of inevitability was gone. Looking back, it is easy to see these moments as a turning point. Not a single battle, not a single decision, but a gradual shift, a realization that the war in the East would not follow the script that had worked so well before. The appearance of the T-34 did not end the German advance, but it forced a reconsideration of everything that advance depended on. It exposed the limits of Blitzkrieg when faced with an enemy capable of absorbing losses and adapting under pressure. It highlighted the importance of industrial capacity, of design innovation, of strategic depth, and it showed that even the most successful tactics could be challenged by something unexpected. In the end, the fog that once concealed those advancing tanks became a kind of symbol, not just of surprise, but of uncertainty, of a war that was no longer predictable, no longer controlled by a single strategy or a single advantage. Because from that point forward, every step deeper into the Soviet Union carried with it a new understanding. This would not be an easy victory. It would be a long war.